the last days of April 1945, Adolf Hitler was sitting in a concrete bunker 50 feet underground in Berlin, and the city above him was burning. The Soviet army was less than a mile away. The war was over in every way that mattered. Everyone in that bunker knew it, and yet Hitler was still giving orders, still moving armies on a map, still believing, or pretending to believe, that Germany could be saved. On April the 21st, 1945, Hitler gave one of his final military orders. He ordered SS General Felix Steiner to launch an attack, a massive counterattack that would cut off the Soviet forces surrounding Berlin, relieve the city, and turn the war around in the final hour. It was the kind of order that sounded like strategy, but was really delusion. Because Felix Steiner looked at what he had: exhausted men, no fuel, no ammunition, no air support, units that existed only on paper. And he made a decision that no SS general was supposed to make. He refused. This is the story of Felix Steiner, the SS general who built some of the most effective fighting forces of the entire war, who bled on every major front, who believed in what he was doing with everything he had, and who, at the very end, looked at a madman's order and said no, not for moral reasons, not because he had suddenly changed his mind about everything, but because he was a soldier, and soldiers don't send men to die for nothing. Felix Steiner was born in 1896 in East Prussia, in a small town called Stahlepunen. He grew up in the kind of place where the military wasn't just respected, it was the center of the community. His father was a soldier. The men around him were soldiers. War was not an abstraction. It was a profession, a calling, something you prepared for your entire life. He entered the German army before World War I, fought through that entire conflict, survived it, which was not guaranteed for anyone who served on the Western Front, and came out the other side with combat experience that would shape everything he did afterward. He had seen what artillery did to infantry. He had seen what happened when soldiers were sent forward in mass formations against prepared defenses. He had watched men die in ways that made no military sense because commanders far from the front were making decisions based on maps rather than reality. And he decided that if he ever commanded men, he would do it differently. Through the 1920s and into the 1930s, Steiner stayed in the military through the Weimar years, studying, thinking, developing his own ideas about how infantry should fight. He believed in small unit tactics, in soldiers who could think for themselves, in training so intense that combat felt easier by comparison, in flexibility rather than rigid obedience to orders that didn't fit the situation on the ground. When the SS began building its military arm in the mid-1930s, Steiner saw an opportunity. The SS was new. It didn't have the rigid traditions of the regular army. It was building from scratch, and that meant someone with ideas, real ideas about how to fight, could actually implement them. Steiner joined the SS Verfügungstruppe, the forerunner of what would become the Waffen-SS, and he started building the kind of unit he had always imagined. His training methods were considered extreme, even by the standards of the German military. Physical conditioning that pushed men to absolute limits. Combat drills repeated until they were automatic. Night operations, navigation without maps, hand-to-hand combat, weapons training with live ammunition in conditions that replicated real combat as closely as possible. Men who trained under Steiner said afterward that nothing they faced in actual battle was as hard as his training. That was exactly what he intended. He formed and commanded the SS Division Deutschland, which later became part of the SS Division Reich. And when the war began in 1939, his men performed exactly as he had trained them to perform: aggressively, independently, effectively. In France in 1940, Steiner's regiment was part of the SS motorized force that drove through Allied positions with speed and aggression that even regular Wehrmacht commanders found impressive. His men were not just physically tough, they were tactically sophisticated in a way that set them apart from standard infantry. On the Eastern Front, Steiner commanded at the division and then corps level, and the scale of what he was dealing with expanded dramatically. Operation Barbarossa in 1941 was a different kind of war than France. The distances were enormous. The enemy was enormous. And the fighting was a level of brutality that made the Western campaigns look almost civilized. Steiner's SS Corps fought on the northern part of the Eastern Front, in the brutal warfare around Leningrad and through the forests and swamps of the Baltic region. The conditions were appalling. The fighting was close, violent, attritional. Men died in huge numbers on both sides. And Steiner kept his units functioning, kept them fighting effectively in conditions that destroyed lesser formations. By 1943 and into 1944, as the German situation on the Eastern Front deteriorated, Steiner's corps was involved in some of the most desperate defensive fighting of the war, retreating, counterattacking, plugging gaps in the line, holding positions that should have been abandoned, losing men constantly and somehow maintaining unit cohesion when everything around them was falling apart. He was promoted to SS Obergruppenführer, the equivalent of a full general. He was one of the senior Waffen-SS commanders in the entire German order of battle, and he was under no illusions about how the war was going. By early 1945, the situation was beyond recovery. The Soviet army was inside Germany. The Western Allies were across the Rhine. Berlin was within striking distance of multiple enemy forces converging from different directions. The German military was running on empty, literally in many cases, with units unable to move because they had no fuel. Manpower was being scraped from anywhere it could be found. Teenagers, old men, soldiers pulled from hospitals, units that existed in name only because the men who should have filled them were dead or captured. In this context, Hitler was still in his bunker under the Reich Chancellery, still holding daily military conferences, still issuing orders for operations that had no connection to military reality. His generals had learned over years of war that disagreeing with Hitler was dangerous, that pointing out the truth of the military situation was treated as defeatism, that the only way to survive in Hitler's inner circle was to nod and agree, and then do what you could with what you had. On April 21, 1945, Hitler ordered Felix Steiner to launch Army Detachment Steiner, a formation that existed mostly on paper, in a massive counterattack from north of Berlin. The attack was supposed to cut through Soviet lines, relieve Berlin, and change the course of the war. Steiner looked at what he actually had: a collection of exhausted, understrength units. Soldiers who had been fighting continuously for weeks with no rest, no resupply, inadequate ammunition, no armor to speak of, no air support. The Luftwaffe had ceased to be a meaningful force. Against them, the Soviet forces numbered in the millions, with thousands of tanks, complete air superiority, and the momentum of an army that knew it was winning. The attack Hitler was ordering was not a military operation. It was a fantasy. Executing it would mean sending men to die for nothing, not to hold a position, not to buy time for an evacuation, not to achieve any realistic objective, just to die because Hitler needed to believe that something was being done. Steiner refused to order the attack. When this information reached the bunker on April 22nd, when it became clear that Steiner was not attacking, that the relief operation was not coming, Hitler had what witnesses described as a complete breakdown. The daily military conference became something that the people present never forgot. Hitler screamed, he raged, he collapsed into his chair. He declared that everyone had betrayed him, that the army had betrayed him, that the SS had betrayed him, that he had been surrounded by cowards and traitors his entire life, that the war was lost. It was one of the few moments when Hitler actually acknowledged, even briefly, the reality of the situation. And it lasted only moments before the wall of delusion rebuilt itself. Steiner was not immediately arrested. The chaos of the final days of the war made enforcement of Hitler's rage difficult. Communications were breaking down. The chain of command was dissolving. Steiner continued to command his forces in the fighting north of Berlin as the Soviet encirclement completed. On May 3, 1945, Steiner surrendered to British forces. The war in Europe ended 6 days later. His post-war life followed a path that was common for senior Waffen-SS officers. He was held by the British, interrogated, and eventually released without being prosecuted at Nuremberg. The Waffen-SS as a whole was declared a criminal organization at Nuremberg, but individual prosecutions of its members were selective, and Steiner was not among those tried. He became part of a network of former Waffen-SS veterans who worked to rehabilitate the image of their branch of the SS, arguing that the Waffen-SS was a military force distinct from the concentration camp guards and the Einsatzgruppen, that its soldiers were professional fighters rather than ideological killers, that they deserved to be treated as soldiers rather than war criminals. This argument has been contested by historians ever since. The reality is more complicated than either side of the debate wants to admit. The Waffen-SS did commit atrocities. Units under its command massacred civilians and prisoners of war on multiple fronts. The organization was built on racial ideology from the beginning. Its members swore a personal oath to Hitler, not to Germany. The idea that it was simply a military force like any other does not survive serious historical examination. At the same time, the hundreds of thousands of men who served in it had a range of motivations and a range of experiences. Not every Waffen-SS soldier personally committed war crimes. Some were conscripted in the later years of the war with little choice about where they served. The moral landscape is not simple. Steiner himself wrote his memoirs after the war, presenting the Waffen-SS in the most favorable light possible, minimizing atrocities, emphasizing military professionalism. He became a respected figure in veteran circles, which is a morally complicated thing to be a respected figure in, given what some of those veterans had done. He died in 1966 in Munich at the age of 69. He had lived long enough to see the Federal Republic of Germany establish itself, to see West Germany rearm, to see the Cold War reshape how the Western world thought about German soldiers, often more charitably than the historical record warranted. The moment history remembers him for is April 1945. The refusal, the phone call that didn't come, the attack that never happened. In the mythology of the final days in the bunker, a mythology built partly on genuine historical record and partly on the dramatic retelling that film and literature have given us, Steiner's refusal is one of the pivotal moments, the moment when even the SS said enough. But it's worth being clear about what that refusal was and what it wasn't. Steiner did not refuse because he had moral objections to the regime he served. He did not refuse because he had suddenly recognized the criminal nature of the organization he had spent his career building. He refused because the order was militarily insane and would have killed his men for nothing. It was a professional soldier's refusal, not a moral one. That distinction matters. It doesn't make the refusal less significant as a military act. But it does complicate the heroic narrative that sometimes gets built around it. Felix Steiner spent his career building and leading some of the most effective and some of the most ideologically compromised military forces of the 20th century. He was genuinely talented as a military commander. He was genuinely committed to the organization and the regime he served. And at the very end, when that regime was asking him to throw lives away for a fantasy, he said no. History gives you men like this and asks you to figure out what to do with them. There is no clean answer. There is only the full story with all its contradictions, told as honestly as it can be. That is the life of Felix Steiner, SS General, military innovator, loyal servant of a criminal regime, and the man who, in the last days of the Third Reich, refused Hitler's final order. Thank you for watching. If this video gave you something to think about, hit the like button. It helps this channel more than you know. Subscribe because we put out new videos every single week, and everyone goes this deep. Drop a name in the comments if there's someone from this era you want us to cover. We read every single one. See you in the next video.